Good evening, everyone. Welcome back for our June Naturalist Night. Tonight, I am excited to introduce Bryce Perog. Bryce is one of our NBC Naturalist volunteers. She went through our naturalist training back in 2017. And since then, she has completed her master's degree from Cal State Fullerton, working on oyster restoration, actually right here in the upper Newport Bay. So I'm excited to have her here tonight with us. To talk to us about that oyster restoration. We will be keeping you all muted during the talk tonight, but if you have a question as Bryce is going through her presentation, feel free to put that in the chat. If it's a quick clarifying question, I will ask Bryce in the moment, and otherwise we will have time for questions at the end. So without any more, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Bryce.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be sharing the research that not only I have done in my master's project, but also that our lab does in Upper Newport Bay. And the main goal of my presentation today is to share with you what living shorelines are and more about restoration between tides. So estuaries are the receiving bodies of freshwater runoff and are connected to the ocean. They're a mix of saltwater and freshwater, and they're tidally influenced, which is very key for oysters. And they also don't have much wave action, so they're very calm areas and are home to a diverse community of organisms, including oxygen-producing plants, filter-feeding animals, and they're also great resting and feeding grounds for not only migrating birds, but also juvenile fish. But because they are such calm, wonderful areas, they also make great places to build businesses, build homes, as well as have ports and harbors. So over time, humans have modified these estuaries drastically to reduce erosion caused by human activity in the bay. So this change in the estuary also is called shoreline armoring or shoreline hardening. And so basically what that means is replacing natural shorelines with something that's hard to reduce erosion caused by boat wakes and different activities in the bay. So on the bottom image here, I have, this is a picture from Newport Bay. We have these large rocks also called riprap, and you can see some oysters scattered here. And then there's also a seawall protecting some beautiful homes. There's also other introduced structures such as these pier pilings that form this dock. And then there's also floating docks and of course floating boats as well. And so in Newport Bay, there is kind of two halves, I like to think of it, to the bay, where in the upper Newport Bay is the marine reserve, and you can see that there's a lot of green from the satellite imagery. And when you look towards the lower Newport Bay, you can actually see that there's not any green. It looks like very hard lines around the bay, and that is because most of it is completely hard armored by seawalls. There are some natural beaches still left, but it is mostly hardened. And so this hard armor has negative ecological impacts as well as economic impact. It increases erosion. So what happens is the waves that it slows down because they're kind of tumbling over these rocks or hitting these seawalls, still has a lot of energy, and then it bounces that energy down shore towards another area that will get eroded. It also has been shown to reduce species richness and abundance and can allow non-Indigenous species, or NIS, to establish and spread. And that could be due to introductions through recreational boats. So here's a sailboat with a lot of non-Indigenous species attached to the hull of the boat, and also international shipping that use the estuaries as ports. And the reason why hard armor might reduce species richness and abundance is because it is fundamentally a different material. You're introducing something that is not on the natural shoreline. And so the native animals that have been evolved, locally adapted to recruiting to specific materials and specific textures, now have their habitat replaced with something else. So there are alternatives to shoreline armoring that still protects the coastline from erosion, but also allows for natural shorelines to persist, as well as native species to have habitat. And these two things are, on the left side, I have living shorelines. So living shorelines is the restoration of a native foundation species. In this image, we have oysters being restored alongside cordgrass, but you can also use eelgrass or other native foundation species. And on the right side is an example of ecological engineering. So this is kind of retrofitting different habitat onto already existing hard armor, such as seawalls. This is pretty popular in Australia, as well as other global ports, where they already have all this hard armor that's been installed, but they want to increase the ecological value of it. So they add concrete with little hidey holes, or we call this rugosity. And also they can change the composition of the concrete to make it more attractive to native animals. So when we're talking about shoreline protection and protecting shoreline using different materials, we have kind of this scale. So on the very far left side, you have very green solutions where you can restore just the native species that naturally helps to accrete sediment, or kind of help when the waves roll over the plant. In this example, it will help to take out the sediment that's suspended in the water. And then on the very right side, on the other side of the spectrum, we have completely hard armor or gray solution. And there are solutions that can be in the middle. So we call this a green-gray approach. And so you can combine kind of harder solutions, such as adding rock to the bottom of restored cordgrass. And there can actually be added benefits to doing this green-gray approach. And it's better suited for higher wave energy environments. So the hard armor at the bottom of that shoreline here will help protect the plants from getting washed away while they grow. So oyster reefs are popular choices for living shorelines because oyster habitat is globally diminished, and they are ecologically important. You can see here on the right all the different animals in this example that depend on oyster reefs. And they have the added benefit also of filtering seawater and keeping pace with sea level rise. So on the right side on the bottom, you can actually see this person has their hand compared to this giant oyster reef. This is not our native oyster. This is on the East Coast, which has a different oyster species. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Here's an example on the left of unfiltered seawater, and then seawater when you add oysters. So you can see it can really help clear up the seawater, not only of pollutants, but also help other subtidal plants grow and algae. And then on the right side, this is an example of oysters that have helped help accrete sediment from the seawater. And you can actually see how they could keep growing on top of each other. And then that's how they outpace sea level rise. So as the seawater comes up, the oysters can keep growing on top of each other and growing landwards. So there are different methods that you can use to restore oysters. There's, again, kind of this more green approach and more gray approach, or the hybrid, right? So on the left side, I have an image of oyster shell that has been set out on a shoreline that's being protected by coir. Coir is this kind of coconut fibers that naturally degrade. So instead of introducing concrete or plastic into the estuaries, you can use coir that eventually break down. And the benefit of that, again, is to protect your restoration while it's still growing. So in this case, instead of cordgrass, it's actually oysters that will be kind of anchoring down those shells. And the green-gray approach is to use oyster reef balls. And so you can use these oyster reef balls by you can make the oyster reef balls by making them into these domes. And so on the inside, it's hollow, and you can see there's holes here where oysters can grow inside and outside of the structure. And there are added benefits of using reef balls, and that includes better wave attenuation. So the waves will slow down as they go across these higher relief, we call them, structures, which is better than the lower lying beds of oysters. So let's now talk about our native oyster, the Olympia oyster, also called Ostriolarita. The Olympia oyster was formed beds on the shorelines of estuaries in all along the US West Coast, as well as going up to Canada and down to Baja California. And in the 18 and 1900s, the push towards the West spurred up these aquaculture efforts to sell the oysters for food. And so our native oyster is pretty slow growing. It has a high mortality rate, and it's also pretty thin. You can see the shell here of a native oyster. And so the beds were pretty quickly degraded. And so what aquaculture farmers did was imported Eastern oysters as well as Pacific oysters to supplement the industry. These oysters are larger, they're faster growing, and they also can be pretty deeply cupped, so they provide more food. So on this top image, you can see a Pacific oyster shell. You can see how deeply cupped it is, and then it's compared to that native Olympia oyster, which is flatter and smaller. But because they are introducing oysters directly into the estuary, some of the oysters escaped this aquaculture and is now found in estuaries along the distribution of the Olympia oyster. So little research on living shorelines restoration projects utilizing Olympia oyster habitat has been performed on the West Coast. I have two maps here. So on the top map, this is actually a screen grab that I got from a conference in 2020, where researchers looked at oyster restoration or oyster living shorelines projects. And so you can see it's very heavily concentrated on the East Coast. There are some projects on the Gulf Coast, and there's only one project that they really found on the West Coast. There are now more projects that, more than just one living shorelines project, but the San Francisco Bay one is the most popular or most well-known on the West Coast. And then on the bottom image is NOAA-funded living shorelines projects, and this is not restricted just to oysters. So you can see even when we're not looking at oysters, most of the projects are on the East and Gulf Coast and very few on the West Coast. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So now we're going to start diving into oyster ecology, and I want to show you what the oysters look like. So I have a Pacific oyster here. They're both juveniles that I'm showing you. So this is a Pacific oyster. It's this darker color, and they're pretty large compared to the native oyster. And they also have these finger-like projections or frills, we call them. And they're much larger than the native Olympia oysters. See, the Olympia oysters are here. They're smaller, they're lighter colored, and you can usually see a lot more of them than the Pacific oyster. And so I also use metric for my scale bars. So just as a comparison, 25 millimeters is 1 inch. So that's about the length of the top of your thumb. And then 1 meter is about 3 feet, which is your wingspan, basically. So first, I'm going to be talking about my master's thesis and my findings, and then I'm going to dive into the Living Shorelines project in Newport Bay. So my project was spurred by the Port of San Diego and their plans to build a living shoreline in their bay. And they wanted to use reef balls because they wanted to get higher relief from wave action because they have some erosion in that bay. And so they wanted to target native Olympia oyster growth and really discourage Pacific oysters because there's a lot in their bay. And so we asked the question, can we modify the surface of reef balls using eco-engineering techniques to favor native species over non-indigenous species recruitment? So on the left side, I have an image of a tile that is just chock full of native oysters. So this is what we really want when we're deploying these reef balls. We really want to see just cover of oysters, and the oysters are also sticking up. So they're providing complex habitat also for other animals, which again is important in these estuaries. And on the right side is a tile that is chock full of non-indigenous species. So this is what we really want to avoid. You can see that there's non-indigenous tunicates here. There's also some sponges and some worms, no oysters. So this is what we really want to avoid. So the way that we approached this question is of if we can discourage recruitment of some species but encourage recruitment of other species is through modifying the reef ball structure. So it's like ecological engineering. So we can add shell to the surface of concrete, and you can think of shell as like this natural material that perhaps native species will prefer. And the thought is that non-indigenous species came here because they were attached to holes or different things that were transported that may not have been natural. So the thinking is that this natural material will recruit more native species. But both oyster species actually have research on them that has shown both of them will recruit onto shelled surfaces. You can also modify how rough the texture is. So this is that bottom image. And rougher textures may recruit more native species. Again, natural habitats are more complex, and we see Pacific oysters often on seawalls. You can see in my background, this is actually an image from Newport Bay. You can see it's chock full of Pacific oysters. You can also manipulate how much, what orientation you offer to the animals. Both oyster species do prefer to be on the bottom of the surfaces. And then you can also manipulate where you deploy these reef balls. If you deploy it at a lower tidal elevation, research shows that you will get more native oysters, but you will also get more non-indigenous tunicates. And then if you deploy at higher tidal elevations, you will have better wave attenuation. So you better meet that goal of decreased shoreline erosion, but you're more likely to get non-indigenous species, including Amphibalanus amphitrite, which is a barnacle, and a non-indigenous barnacle, and also Pacific oysters. So this is how my project was designed. We had treatment, or we had concrete tiles with different treatments on them, where rugosity, again, that's that surface roughness. We had low rugosity and high rugosity on the columns. And then for the rows, we have shell cover. So 0% shell cover and 100% shell cover. So in total, we had these 4 treatments that we really compared in analyses: smooth concrete, rough concrete, fine shell, and then full shell. We also had a couple of reference treatments. We deployed these in 2018 into 2 tidal elevations, one at that higher tidal elevation that we're going to get better wave attenuation, and then one at the lower tidal elevation that we think we're going to get more Olympia oysters. And we deployed one at Coney Island in Newport Bay. So this is about midway through the bay. I have a star here for Back Bay Science Center and the Moose Center just for your reference. And then also at 2 sites in San Diego Bay. This is what the sites look like. You can see they look pretty different. Where we have a natural cobble field, this is Newport Bay. This is not the project, this is something different, but that's basically how we suspend our tiles. And then here is East Street. It's a large mud flat. And then lastly, we have Grand Crebe. You can see riprap in the background with lots of Pacific oysters on them. And then here is what the tiles looked like in the field, suspended horizontally. So the bottom surface is exposed as well as the top. And then here's the treatments. We have terracotta tile, rough, fine, and half. So here are some qualitative results. On the columns, I have the site. So this is E Street, Grand Caribe. These are the San Diego sites, and then Coney Island is on the right. And then we have tidal elevation. So I have the higher tidal elevation first. So at E Street, we have our tiles just full of non-indigenous barnacles, and then there's also some Pacific oysters here. At Grand Caribe, there's no barnacles really, but there's almost 80 to 100% cover of Pacific oysters. And then at Coney Island, not much recruited there. We did see that there were microscopic spirorbid worms, which are these calcium carbonate shelled worms, but you can't see them. They're microscopic. And then at 0 meters mean lower low water, 0.6 meters mean lower low water is 2 feet. And then 0 is 0 feet. At 0 at E Street, we actually found a mix of both Pacific and Olympia oysters, which was a really surprising finding because we normally see these Pacific oysters at higher tidal elevations. So that was really worrisome when we found that at E Street. But at Grand Caribe, we found that we had almost 100% cover of these native oysters, and it was really successful there. And then lastly, at Coney Island, there was some recruitment of native Olympia oysters, but we actually had a lot of other fouling species, most of them non-indigenous, such as this colonial tunicate called Botrytis schlosseri is taking up a lot of the percent cover of this tile, and all these little tiny dots, those are all of those spirorbid worms, and they actually have an unknown origin, so we don't know really if they're native or non-native, and we also don't know their ecological impact. So there's a future project for some students. We also found that there was a large difference in the upper and undersides of the tiles. Here is the top on the left, and on the bottom, you can see heavy recruitment of the oysters. And then really interestingly, we found that adding shell resulted in less Pacific oyster recruitment. Treatment didn't really matter for Olympia oysters when we looked at its preferred tidal elevation. So at 0 meters mean lower low water, there was no treatment effect. But we found that adding shell actually decreased the amount of Gigas cover, or I'm sorry, Pacific oyster cover. And then that is compared here to smooth, where you can see it's mostly Pacific oysters. And then the Pacific oysters here on this full tile are only at the corners. And then there's actually some native oysters that are scattered within here. And native oysters recruited in highest abundances at 0.6 meters mean lower low water on these full shell treatments where there were these nice hidey holes where they could recruit to, and also there was less Pacific oysters that they could be competing with, but they still recruited in the highest abundances to 0 meters mean lower low water. And then here is Coney Island. We can see on this smooth tile that there was heavy recruitment of these non-indigenous species. We can actually see these solitary tunicates now. These are called Stiella plicata. And then when we had full shell, we saw less non-indigenous species. Again, this is Botrytis schlosseri. You can see it takes up much of the tile's percent cover. There's one oyster here. And then on full shell and high rugosity, we see less of these non-indigenous space competitors. And this is at 0 meters mean lower low water. And then at 0.6 meters mean lower low water on full, we actually had pretty high recruitment of Olympia oysters. So you can see some oysters hiding kind of underneath these shells. And it actually had similar recruitment strength at both tidal elevations when you took into account the full shell treatment. So that was really good news. And then we also, when we looked at what treatments were best for Pacific oysters, we found that it depended on what site you're at. So at E Street, the Pacific oysters actually recruited more to the lower tidal elevation on the rough treatment, so that concrete that was roughened. And then at Grand Caribe, they recruited in highest abundances to the higher tidal elevation on the smooth treatment, which matches the seawalls. So that was pretty interesting as well. And then lastly, we have this non-indigenous barnacle, Amphibalanus amphitrite. We also found that it was its abundance was decreased when we added shell cover as well as rugosity. So that full shell treatment really reduced its percent cover. Another interesting find is that when we did analyses, we actually factored in also dead shell. And so remember that these oyster reefs, they're not only just live living oysters that filter water, they also are considered habitat. So they provide habitat to other animals as well as subsequent oyster recruits. And so you can see here that they're actually adding more rugosity and more niches available to other animals. And I've also seen this in settlement. This is a 2-week-old settler, and there's already animals growing inside of its shell. So it's providing habitat even at the microscopic scale. So major findings of my project was, if you build it, they will come. We had really high recruitment of oysters in San Diego Bay, not as much in Newport Bay, but we did find that oysters grew on the concrete treatment with full shell at these higher tidal elevations, which is exciting because if we do deploy reef balls in these high erosion areas, we actually could manipulate the surface so that we get more native oysters and less non-indigenous species that compete with the oyster. And then we found that high rugosity and high shell cover, they actually allow more Olympia oysters than Pacific oysters outside of its normal tidal elevation range. So if we did deploy up higher to at a higher tidal elevation to help better attenuate wave action, we now have a treatment that can help do that. And then we can also manipulate the reef balls further by adding more undersurface. So one idea is to kind of have these larger shells jut out of concrete so that has more undersurface available for oysters to grow. And then also rugosity and shell cover have negative impacts on other non-indigenous species. So that was pretty exciting findings. So now I'm going to talk about living shorelines in Newport Bay. So in 2016, researchers started this project where they wanted to pair restoration of 2 native foundation species. They wanted to do eelgrass and oysters and do this paired restoration to see actually if they can have mutually beneficial effects on each other. And the reason for that is that eelgrass helps remove sediment from water and relieve pH stress for oysters. And oysters help to improve water quality through their filtering and provide nitrogen back into the sediment for the eelgrass. So there could be possibly a symbiosis there. So the way that they studied this was to study the two foundation species next to each other. So I have the ocean here at the top, the land here at the bottom. So you can imagine yourself looking out into the ocean. And then you have the paired oyster and eelgrass. And then they study eelgrass alone, oysters alone, and then compared to just bare, untouched mudflat. And they have 4 sites in the kind of middle of Newport Bay. So here are the red dots of the 4 sites. Here's the Back Bay Science Center, and here is my site, Coney Island, just for reference. And so what they do is they take this mud flat area. So here's a couple images of mud flats. This is actually right next to the Back Bay Science Center. And then they restore the eelgrass. So the way that they do that is they take eelgrass from flourishing meadows in a different place, and then they take some of it and they use this, I think it's hemp fiber, and they attach it to popsicle sticks. And then that, you can see here, that's how they carry it, kind of using this plastic board. And then divers will go and actually plant it under the water, and they do this in a plotted design, so it's right next to the oyster beds. And then for the restoration of the oysters, you can see here that there is a huge pile of shell. This actually isn't even the half of it. There is a ton of shell that they have, and you can see in the back, this is actually me for reference, that they have crates stacked high with oyster shell in them. And then what they can do is put that into coir bags, that coconut coir bags, and then use a ton of volunteers to help put it onto the shoreline. And then a different method is to actually lay out the coir, put the shell in it, and then roll it like a burrito. So they actually call this like an oyster burrito. And much of this research is done kind of during sunrise, so you can see the nice sunrise for this restoration event. But much of our research is done in the middle of the night because that is when low tide is. So as glamorous as we look in these waders, we also have mud and headlights, so it's very fun. And so what now I want to kind of talk to you about what we study on the living shorelines that were built. So here is a living shoreline example. This is of the East Coast oyster, that Crossostrea virginica. Remember I said it grows really big. So you can see that they're pretty big here on this oyster bed. And we have Cody from Cal State Long Beach, and he actually uses like a GoPro underwater and studies the animal usage of the beds. We have Alicia from Cal State Long Beach that studies the life underneath the sediment that is under the oyster bed. So once we pull oysters from the bed, she takes like a mud sample. Oops. And then we have two undergraduate students. We have Nicolina and Maddie, and they study the bird usage of these beds. Then we have Valerie. She's a grad student at Cal State Fullerton, and she looks at the effect of humans on that kind of trample the beds, as well as boat wake impacts on spreading of the beds. And then we also take samples from these oyster beds, and those are used later in labs. So what we do is we have a couple of students, or actually we have many students here that use these samples. So we have Cody from Cal State Long Beach. He looks at the animal usage of the oysters, basically. So what other animals are on these oysters. We have Valerie that kind of quantifies them, and also how consolidated the beds are. So how well the oysters are kind of sticking to each other. And then we have Mason that studies oyster abundance and eelgrass health. So he looks at biomass and nitrogen and different aspects of the eelgrass, and he also helps to restore the eelgrass as part of the project. And then the oysters are also looked at for biomass and condition index. So basically how healthy these oysters are, not only for their like filtering capacity, but also if you have healthy oysters, they're more likely to be more reproductive and thus perpetuate this oyster bed. And that project is taken on by our grad student at Cal State Fullerton, Brandon, and then also Myra, who's an undergrad. And this wouldn't be possible without our principal investigators. We have Katie from OC Coastkeeper, we have Christine Whitcraft from CSU Long Beach, and then Dr. Danielle Zackrell from CSU Fullerton. So if you are interested in our research, what can you do? I want to have a plug for iNaturalist. I really love iNaturalist because it actually is really helpful to the scientific community. Last summer, I worked on a project with Pew Charitable Trusts and the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative, where we actually used iNaturalist observations to help map Olympia and Pacific oysters along the coast to get an up-to-date map of where these oysters reside and also how abundant they are. So you can take pictures of those. Just a note, if you are going to use iNaturalist, it's really helpful in identification if you use some kind of scale. So you can use like your finger in the photo, or if you bring along a ruler, awesome. Also, you can have other things in the image that help the identifier to know what tidal elevation you're at. Remember that Pacific oysters are generally found higher in the barnacle zone. So that actually helps to identify the oyster. You can also, here I have other common species that are in the bay. And these are actually non-indigenous, but we're going to go through them nonetheless. We have the spaghetti bryozoan, the striped barnacle, that's that Amphibalanus amphitrite, and then also water Cyporus subtorquata, the red rust bryozoan. It's really pretty, it's bright red, and it also can be black here. It's pretty interesting. And then some other things that you can identify in the bay, again, to help just understand the distribution of these animals is really helpful to researchers. This is all tunicates actually. So here we have Botrytis schlosseri. It can be red, orange, and black and white. We have the sea vase, Siona robusta. And then this is the pleated sea squirt. I actually showed you a photo of this on my the tile that I showed you. And then we also have Styla clava, the stocked sea squirt. Other things that you can do are to be on the lookout for outreach events on coastkeeper.org. So that's Katie Nichols. She works for OC Coastkeeper that I mentioned before. She's one of the PIs on our project, or principal investigators. And she posts on social media as well for different events that they're hosting. You can also include this in your living shorelines when you're doing kayak tours because it is right next to the Back Bay Science Center. And sometimes I even see the kayakers just floating over the beds. So it's a perfect opportunity for education. And then just being careful of the beds if you are floating over them. Make sure that they don't scrape on them. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I'm going to go ahead and allow people to unmute themselves if anyone has questions for Bryce.
I do.
Rita?
Yeah, I have a question. I missed it. Those species that you were showing under iNaturalist to look out for, are those non-indigenous or are those native species?
So the ones that I showed you actually were all non-indigenous. Those ones were common on my recruitment tiles that I put out. So I show them because it could help researchers to document where the non-indigenous species have spread. But the only native animal on there was the Olympia oyster. Everything else was non-indigenous.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. What was really interesting actually, what was really interesting about Newport Bay was that it had a lot of other non-indigenous species recruiting, but like there were only 9 Pacific oysters that recruited to the tiles compared to San Diego, where you saw they were like taking over the entire tiles. So it was pretty interesting.
Bryce, I have a couple of questions.
Great.
Oysters filter out suspended particles in the water. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, and we assume they're all pollutants?
No.
Okay.
So because the estuaries are watersheds, right? So the water comes from our land, and there's could be some pollutants in the water that ends up going into the bay. And so the oysters can take in some of those pollutants, but also there's a ton of algae in the water. And when you have too much, for example, like fertilizer in the water, that can cause these algae to bloom. And these oysters can help control that bloom before it causes ecological damage. So that's how they can help the ecosystem, not only by filtering out the pollutants, but also helping to control the algae. But they do actually like ingest and live off of algae. That's what they use as their food source.
Okay, thank you for that. This is a two-part question. The second part is the pollutants. They're filtered out by the oyster. Well, then what happens to the pollutant? Where does it go?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So there is research that actually looks into, for example, heavy metals in these oysters and how much they're getting. We just think of them kind of like as a sink, basically. So they're eating the pollutants and it's staying in their bodies until they die, but eventually that will get eaten by something else, right? So I'm not fully informed on that whole life cycle of pollutants, but it is just a way to either put it into the sediment so it's not out in the water still, because they can get, the oysters can be buried, but yeah, I'm not 100% informed on that. There is research out there though.
Okay, thank you, Bryce. I feel more like a whole person now that I know some of that.
Sorry, I couldn't fully answer your question.
That's okay. That's good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a question, Bryce. I think I remember correctly in your project, you found that the native oysters liked the rougher surfaces better. Was that correct? Do you have any theory as to why that might have been?
Yeah, sure. So the native oyster preferred the rougher surface when it was rough shell. And so the reason, I'm going to pull up a picture. The reason I think that is actually pretty well showcased by Coney in Newport. And so what we can see here, bear with me, sorry, taking a minute. Whoa, oh, that's actually pretty good. So what we can see here is that the native oysters, their umbo, so their umbo is like kind of where their hinge is and they can open and close from there. That's also where their growth begins. And so you can see their umbo is kind of underneath these shells. And so it could be that the rougher surface provides these micro habitats that are pretty protected. So the intertidal zone is a pretty stressful place. If you are an oyster, you have wind, you have drying out to worry about, you have it being too hot, you have it being too cold. You also have predators to worry about if oysters could worry. And so having these small protected areas underneath the shell, I think allowed these oysters to grow there. I also think because there wasn't as many competitors, so you can see here there's lots of these little worms, right? And then if we scroll even more to the left, we can see this heavily fouled plate. So there's not as many competitors when you're up higher in the intertidal. So this full shell allows microhabitat that's available and protection from the elements. And I think that helps to allow the oysters to grow up there.
Cool, that all makes sense, yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else have any questions for Bryce? Wait a minute for people to think. Well, thank you so much, Bryce. We're getting some thank yous in the comments. Thank you for sharing this with us. I personally didn't know that any of this work was happening in the Bay, so it's really cool to learn about it. And thank you for being here tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us. This talk was recorded, and so we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel in a couple weeks. And we will be back in July for Naturalist Night. It will be again the second Thursday of the month. And I'll be able to release some more information about that, hopefully by next week. So stay tuned and have a good night.